Welcome to this video panel by the Center for Geopolitics. My name is Quentin Lin. I'm the acting director for the center and will be the moderator for the panel today on One Belt, One Road, train wreck or masterstroke. So even as Chinese General Secretary Xi Jinping has reaffirmed China's commitment to his Belt and Road Initiative last month at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, we're learning that China has drastically curtailed the overseas lending programs of its two largest policy banks last year, and following a 3-year trend of reduced commitment. So we've read in Financial Times that research shows that lending by Chinese Development Bank and Export-Import Banks of China has collapsed from a peak of $75 billion in 2016 to just $4 billion last year. And there are clear signs that policymakers in Beijing are seriously reassessing the financial sustainability, reputation risks, and geopolitical repercussions of investing in the initiative. To make sense of this critical moment in China's historic economic expansionism and the framework for Xi's personal vision of the China dream, we brought together today 3 experts with great insights into the region. So first, Eyck Freymann is the author of One Belt, One Road, Chinese Power Meets the World from Harvard Press. He's a doctoral candidate at Balliol College, Oxford. It's a great achievement to have a research monograph published before the completion of the PhD, but moreover, the project has been a labor of love, starting from his undergraduate years at Harvard, through his MPhil study at Cambridge, and he's now expanding it as a PhD project at Oxford. We have John Hillman, who is the director of Reconnecting Asia project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's the author of the new book, The Emperor's New Road, China and the Project of the Century, from Yale University Press. And we're particularly pleased to announce their new books because I've read these 2 books this week. They're extremely engaging and timely and provide unvarnished first-hand data, including extensive direct observations from personal trips to these regions and primary data collected from local governments and corporate sources. Both books cover the 2 most discussed poor projects of Gwadar and Hambantota. Eyck covers Bagamoyo in Tanzania and Paris in Greece, and John has visited Djibouti and transport and logistics hubs in Central Asia. So both delivers a regional implication for Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Middle East, and North Africa. And this is where our last panelist comes in. Teresa Fallon is the founder and director of the Center for Russia, Europe, Asian Studies in Brussels. She's a senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and she's been cited in recent analysis on NATO, on the convergence of transatlantic threat perceptions vis-a-vis China and implications on NATO, and on the pandemic's impact on EU's bilateral relations with China. So her first-hand direct experience with strategy and policy-making aspects of BRI will be particularly valuable for our discussion today. Now, the common things we'll be examining is how BRI pulls together several strands of domestic imperatives and international opportunities. We all agree that BRI is opaque and vague in designs. It's an open-ended architecture. But a lack of a priori logic and policy and institutional design doesn't mean that it doesn't have a cumulative and coherent impact on development and international politics. For the long run, Chinese market presence in investment could easily and greatly shape standard setting, transport and telecom networks, social and environmental safeguards, and the nature of global peacekeeping and military competition well into the 21st century. Moreover, how the West, especially the United States and EU, respond to BRI could paradoxically help it become a more coherent geopolitical project, such as by making strange bedfellows of Russia and China and pushing some countries to choose a side, therefore reducing their strategic autonomy. So this is something we would very much like to discuss today. On the supply side of BRI, we want to think about what happens when the wallet is pinched, right? So when China's resources is reduced and the domestic political will is probably weakened and the direction of development might well be shifting, which will have a different impact on the economic logic of the BRI. Now, on the demand side, we will be talking about how poor governance and political permissiveness for corruption and these long-term hidden economic costs of the project leading countries and people in the countries to become unhappy and politicians to play on their discontent to seek to revise terms of the Chinese investment. So will these political actions drive China to impose better governance? Will these actions motivate China to defend authoritarianism, to put down local critics? So these are the big questions. And as usual, before we enter into conversation, I would like to make some very quick technical comments. We'll start the event with some introductory comments by the panelists before we move into the broader conversation. And through that discussion, I would like to encourage you, the audience, to ask questions for the panelists. And you can do that by using the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. And when you ask a question, please start by writing your name and your affiliation first. If your question is for a specific panelist, please make sure to state that at the onset. We have a very big audience today, which is great, but it also means that I will not unfortunately be able to pick all your questions, and I apologize for that in advance. I also want to mention that the event is being recorded, and we'll be posting the recording on our website for, over the next few days. So first, let me turn to Eyck. You've discussed OBRR from its origin to the specific projects and to the various facets of the power. So you talk about three phases of the power of OBRR. It's a diverse set of overseas investment and construction projects. It's also a concept or a brand for Chinese power on the global stage. And lastly, it's a bottom-up campaign by individuals, companies, and institutions to pay lip service to Xi Jinping and the brand. Could you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. And first of all, let me say thank you, Casey, for hosting this event. It's a privilege to be back at Cambridge and to share a virtual stage with two of the people who work on this topic who I respect most. John, who's built an amazing community at CSIS and an unparalleled data set, actually quantifying what China has been doing and using exciting geolocation mapping to understand how they link up, as well as with Teresa, who's just a force of nature. We haven't met in person, but I've followed her over a long period of time, and just one of the most insightful commentators on China-Europe relations alongside many other topics. So One Belt, One Road, let me start with my general pitch and then dig into your question, Casey. One Belt, One Road is the signature policy of the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, who, as we know, has eliminated term limits and intends to serve for a long time, if not for life. It entails the expenditure of hundreds of billions of dollars under the umbrella of a vaguely defined slogan that seems to know no geographic boundary. We've seen brand extensions of the Belt and Road that seem to suggest it will encompass the Arctic, Latin America, as well as outer space and cyberspace. So it seems that nowhere where this concept of One Belt, One Road, in Chinese, Yi Dai, Yi Lu, cannot actually touch. It has, on a domestic level, entailed the rallying of an unprecedented grassroots effort encompassing every national ministry, every province, nearly every major city and town, basically every state-owned enterprise within the Chinese system, as well as lots of private enterprises, including foreign enterprises, those in Hong Kong, major Western firms like Standard Chartered, HSBC, Walmart, Allianz, that want to show their goodwill in order to secure their continued access to the Chinese market. So one of the difficulties that we faced in trying to assess One Belt, One Road is first to define what it is. China has spent over $2 trillion in foreign direct investment since 2005. Some of that takes the form of the sorts of infrastructure mega projects that we usually associate with the Belt and Road, right? Gigantic port cities built from scratch in countries like Sri Lanka or Tanzania. Other times it entails the investment in higher tech enterprises, like German robotics companies or cloud computing services in Malaysia. And then sometimes we see instances where investments that are plausibly under the Belt and Road framework don't seem to be particularly centrally coordinated. Often they're half-baked, abandoned midway, and it's hard to tell exactly how much political impetus they have behind them and whether we should evaluate them alongside other initiatives like Huawei's 5G development, that I think we can all agree are probably pretty high priority in the Communist Party's view. I take the argument that yes, undoubtedly One Belt, One Road entails the building of a lot of stuff all around the world, which both intrinsically will create new issues and opportunities related to connectivity and trade, but also introduces political ripple effects, including as the participant countries take on debt. But I think the way that we should approach this vaguely defined initiative, and we have to define it before we can assess whether it's effective or not, is to trace its historical roots within China, and then to try to understand how the Chinese propaganda apparatus and administrative state have communicated to each other what it is that they are trying to do. The cover of my book has a rather provocative image of Xi Jinping as a new emperor. This image was made by my father, but it actually sums up, I think, one of the most remarkable elements of this, which is that in parallel to all the infrastructure that China has been building, it has also been engaged in a bottom-up and comprehensive ideological campaign to rewrite the history, the underlying history and basic facts of the ancient Silk Road in order to bring them more closely into juxtaposition with what Xi Jinping himself is trying to do. In particular, there has been a rewrite of the textbooks that every Chinese student must study in order to pass the Gaokao College entrance exam. And when we look at that alongside the Belt and Road propaganda, not the propaganda for foreigners, but the propaganda for Chinese audiences in Chinese, such as the 6-part documentary series that aired on CCTV in 2016. The message is impossible to misread. Han Di, who was the second longest serving emperor in Chinese history, ruled for 54 years, doubled the extent of the Han Dynasty, widely regarded as the greatest emperor in Chinese history, created the ancient Silk Road. And Xi Jinping is his avatar, his second coming, and is here to restore it. Now, we can see evidence of Xi Jinping's linking himself to this historical legacy through more examples than I can name here. The details are in the book. But the point is that this has taken on a distinct element of personality cult that exists in tandem to, but in many ways on top of, the infrastructure initiative that Xi Jinping inherited from his predecessors. That's point one, that within the Chinese system, it is being pitched not just as a Marshall Plan style campaign to invest abroad, but actually as a project of imperial rejuvenation or restoration with Xi Jinping himself at the center. But the second point that I make in the book, and I investigate this through a number of case studies, is that in fact, China rebuilding a sort of imperial style tributary system, strange as it might sound to Western ears, is actually attracting willing partners. Not everywhere, but in fact, in most of the countries where it has been introduced, including some of the best known and studied examples like Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and Greece. Cases where politicians have made international headlines for pushing back against Chinese investments. The story has not actually been one of debt trap diplomacy, that China lures or coerces or tricks gullible, small little countries into taking out debt to build projects that they can't afford. In fact, it has much more to do with the process of elite capture, in which China is offering a value proposition to local elites, local political parties. Essentially, they will give China long-term status benefits by acknowledging Xi Jinping's centrality and China's contributions. And in return, China will give them political favors, some visible, some less visible, and will give them economic benefits, often in the form of investment that can help them to stay in power. And we can dive into the details later, and I want to give John and Teresa an opportunity to weigh in. But I think what is unique or unusual about my own perspective, which I develop in the book, is that despite the fact that many of these projects have lost money, despite the fact that COVID-19 has wreaked havoc with the economic model of most of this infrastructure. I mean, as of the summer, the Chinese Foreign Ministry was saying that 60% of Belt and Road projects were encountering issues or slowdowns as a result of the pandemic. That number is surely higher now, even though China has all but cut off its funding for new debt-financed investments. The Chinese system continues to embrace the Belt and Road phrase. Why? Because it has a domestic salience relevant to Xi Jinping that is irrespective of what is actually being built abroad. And we see foreign partner countries, including important ones like the Russians and the Iranians, continue to pay lip service to the initiative, now for new reasons, not because they want a port or a road, but because they want maybe a vaccine or a digital services agreement with China. So in conclusion, to reiterate the point, One Belt, One Road is not specifically referring to a Marshall Plan style development program. It's actually a much broader ideological campaign to put China at the center of the international system. And it is offering an incentive structure and value proposition to partner countries that basically works. So on the spectrum of train wreck to masterstroke, I come down closer to masterstroke.
Excellent. John, one thing that's really interesting about your book is that you draw numerous historical analogies and very appropriate ones, very insightful ones. For example, to the expansion of Anglo-American power via the Suez Canal, to railway projects in Northeast China in the late 19th century. And a theme that emerged from these comparisons is how weak countries, while they have been tools of great power interests, they are also active agents of resistance to these powers as well as to forces of globalization. So in your own words, you say, far from being pawns, smaller countries are often the most pivotal players. And I was wondering how you would assess this expectation given the sort of intensified competition between the US and the PRC in recent years and the inward turning of not only these superpowers, but many other countries and economies since the pandemic. Could you tell us more about this?
Thank you. Thanks, Casey, and thank you for organizing this. Congratulations to Eyck for getting a great book out there with some really good case studies. I think it's really interesting that more than 7 years now after this Belt and Road Initiative, One Belt, One Road Initiative was announced, we're still discussing some pretty basic questions about what is this thing, right? And I think as analysts, there's this constant struggle between needing to sort of impose some order so that you can reach some conclusions about what's going on, but not imposing order, necessarily where it doesn't exist, right? Not making this something that it isn't, and being comfortable with some of the intentional vagueness and flexibility of this framework. And Casey, as you mentioned, this is one of the central arguments in my book, is the agency of countries who are participating in this. And I approach the book by looking at Belt and Road activities in several regions. It's mainly focused on the supercontinent of Eurasia. That happens to be where most of the world's economic power is, where most of the world resides. But there is also a chapter on East Africa, which I think you alluded to in the beginning. It's a combination of looking at individual projects and regions and some travel to lots of projects. But it's also, I try to use history as a yardstick to compare China to other rising powers. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that, as new as Belt and Road sounds, and as sort of new as some of these activities appear, China is far from the first rising power to pursue large projects beyond its borders. And so I think thinking in historical terms, there are lots of interesting parallels. Chinese officials would have you think that, the period of time that they would like you to think about is, thinking about the ancient Silk routes. And it's sort of a romanticized version of that period. And they'll quote Marco Polo. That's in their retelling, it's a period of cultural exchange. The reality is life was not very easy during that time. But I think when we actually start to look at history here, I think the period of time that is a little bit more accurate is probably the period leading up to World War I. Now, I don't mean to imply that's exactly where we're headed in terms of a conflict, but you had lots of established powers using large infrastructure projects beyond their borders. And so those are some parallels that I dig into in the book. In some cases, the parallels are very striking. I mean, you have China literally building a rail project from Nairobi to Mombasa alongside a rail project that the British built. And it's also interesting. It's somewhat revealing into some of the mismanagement of the Belt and Road. I think that they felt compelled to build a new rail project there rather than rehabilitating the existing project, which is what the World Bank had recommended. Some of the other parallels include, activities that Japan was doing in Southeast Asia, in the 1970s, 1980s. And in many respects, Japan is the incumbent power in Southeast Asia. And this is a part of the current story that I think sometimes gets overlooked. Japan today is still outspending China in important parts of Southeast Asia. And many of the criticisms of Japan in the 1980s sound very similar to criticisms of Chinese projects today, using loans at interest rates that are too high, favoring their own companies, building large infrastructure projects when the recipient countries might have other needs, schools and health systems and so on, and also allegations of corruption. I think though the difference is, Japan really learned from that experience and has really improved its practices, has become a provider of really high standard infrastructure. And many of the sort of the lessons it learned, China may also learn, but it doesn't have to endure the same pressures. It doesn't have a partner, as sort of a partner like the United States, an ally to push it to move in a more positive direction. It's, officials are more insulated from some outside criticism. And so I think that there's definitely learning going on, but barriers to change are high. And I don't leave the United States out of this story either. In the chapter on Pakistan in this book, I look at the period in which U.S. officials were quite active in Pakistan during the early days. And I find in those activities in the 50s and 60s some interesting parallels with how Chinese officials have approached Pakistan in recent years. A similar overconfidence and almost hubris in thinking that your economic toolkit, which might have worked at home, could be exported into a foreign country where the barriers, the level of difficulty is much higher. And Gwadar Port, which gets a lot of attention these days as a sort of white elephant that may become a Chinese military facility in the future, was once offered to President Richard Nixon. And the U.S. National Security Council under Henry Kissinger looked at the project and decided to decline on that offer. Their conclusion was, this was probably mostly driven by domestic political incentives, that the project's success would depend on it not being a white elephant, which they weren't confident about. And in the meantime, they would antagonize many others in the region. And I think lots of those things still hold true today, with Gwadar not being commercially successful, having antagonized some in the region. And so, the point of all of this is that I think it's quite natural that China is trying to do some of what it's doing through the Belt and Road as a rising power. But if we look at the historical record, I think we also gain an appreciation for how difficult this is. It's incredibly difficult to do these large projects anywhere. Large infrastructure projects typically cost more than expected, take longer than expected, and deliver fewer benefits than expected. And that's including in the best business environments in the world. And China is going into some very difficult business environments. And I think we see some of the learning happening now as we see the Belt and Road levels of activity declining. The recent Financial Times article pointing out that, project lending by China Development Bank, China Exim Bank, the two largest players from the Chinese side in the story, really dropped off dramatically last year. That's consistent with other data that we've seen. It's much more pronounced than some of the data, and it's only part of the picture. I think it's also a reminder, though, that here we are coming to the end of 2020, and we're talking about data from 2019. And so there's a gap here in our understanding of what this is, what the Belt and Road is. The lack of transparency makes it really hard as outside analysts to get a firm hold on what's going on, and it's evolving. That's really probably one of the advantages of the lack of project criteria, and this being a very vague construct, is it can continue to evolve and try to fit the circumstances of the day. As Eyck mentioned, even though this is really encountered some difficulties, it's not going anywhere. It's enshrined in the Chinese Communist Party constitution. And I think that even if Xi Jinping were to leave, which no one is expecting anytime soon, someone would come up with a new slogan, because at the end of the day, China as a rising power has an interest in doing many of these activities. And as long as it has the will and the wallet, I expect that it will be active outside of its borders.
Thank you, John. So part of this evolution has been the addition of new dimensions of the Silk Road, right? So China has added the digital Silk Road, the health Silk Road in response to the pandemic, and the polar Silk Road since 2 or 3 years ago. So what are the significances of these new extensions? They seem to be, for one thing, more strongly linked to national defense and civil military fusions than the previous pure infrastructure projects. So I'd like to turn to Teresa and ask her from the perspective of Brussels. Some of the books in the chapters in the books by John and Eyck talked about Central and Eastern Europe and as bridgeheads toward Chinese influence in the region. One of the arguments that John made was that China's threat, as reflected in this declining sort of public views of the world of China and Xi's public image, have risen sufficiently to the height to drive Europeans to a common response to Chinese economic encroachment. And I was wondering, Teresa, if you could tell us more about that. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. Casey invited me to this event. Even though it's virtually, I'm so delighted to be at Cambridge on such an impressive stage with 2 new published authors, Jonathan Hillman and Eyck Freymann. Congratulations on your outstanding books. Everyone think about them for the holidays. And you ask, is it a masterstroke or train wreck? In some respects, after several years, 2 fresh new books about this topic, we are all talking about China's Belt and Road Initiative. So from that point of view, it's actually brilliant marketing. And because I'm based here in Brussels, I have maybe a slightly different take on something. So I just want to mention shortly after the Belt and Road Initiative was first announced, they held a conference here in Brussels, and with the very catchy title, Did You Really Hear What Xi Jinping Said? Because Europe was so slow in responding, and China expected the whole world to really be like, sit up and take notice on this massive, program. But because the EU itself, the European Union, likes rules, it has an approach, it needs clarity. This was really the opposite of what the Belt and Road Initiative was, because it was kind of amorphous, ambiguous, and unclear. So I think the EU is extremely slow to respond to initially the Belt and Road Initiative. And as Jonathan pointed out, and KC, that the timing of this is brilliant, since the FT is focusing on yesterday a great article about how it's losing finance. But one other anecdote I want to share, in 2011, Hillary Clinton announced the Silk Road proposal in India, and it was to help Afghanistan. It was a different direction, but the reason it failed was lack of funding. So we see that even that word Silk Road, I was on a panel once with some Chinese speakers, participants, and they were saying, we cried for days when Hillary Clinton called it the Silk Road, because we really wanted it for ourselves. We couldn't believe she took that name. They felt ownership of it, even though the term was coined by a German. So, they really were upset by this. And that might also be part of the reason for this kind of clunky name. So, okay. All right, so you mentioned about, it predates the Silk Road Initiative. It was called the 16+1. So it's 11 EU member states and 5 possible accession states. And last year, 2019, they included Greece. So all of a sudden became 17+1. The Piraeus port is folded into the Piraeus port in Greece is folded into the Belt and Road narrative, but it was never originally, the Chinese had invested in there long before the Belt and Road Initiative was even a twinkle in Xi Jinping's eye. So we see now with the addition of Greece, we have a land-sea corridor, which if you think about it, it's quite a dramatic, from nothing to this land-sea corridor, from the Piraeus port up through Central and Eastern Europe, all the way to the Baltics. And so in Brussels, when it was first discussed in the European Parliament, a Chinese presenter announced that 2 Chinese officials were in a stairwell and they ran into each other and they dropped all their files. And then when they were picking up the files together, they're like, why are you working on these and I'm working on these? Let's just combine them all together. And so the narrative was always that it was never a strategy, it was never a plan, it was just happenstance. It just happened all by accident. But we really see some, common issues between these countries with kind of shallow roots in democracy and having this kind of shared past. And this has been kind of a headache for Brussels, because I call it like throwing, spaghetti at the wall and you see what sticks. So out of all of those member states, the 11 EU member states didn't receive so much investment from China as, say, Serbia. Serbia is the biggest non-EU member state in this grouping, and it has received the bulk of the investments. So we've seen in a very short period of time, it's not just infrastructure, but it's also military cooperation. For example, they have a drone program, smart cities. You have PLA officers on the ground in Serbia giving advice. And so Serbia is a very interesting story as well because of what happened in 1999 with the bombing of the Chinese embassy, the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy. And so everyone in China remembers this date. They were all allowed to leave school. They protested. They were throwing rocks and bottles at the US consulates and embassy, and marching, had the day off from school to march and complain. So it's something that every young Chinese student remembers because they had the day off from school. But most people in Europe kind of forgot about this, but not the Serbs, of course. And so Xi Jinping made his first visit to Serbia of a high-level Chinese leader. It was the first time in 30 years. And one of the first things he did was to place a wreath at the Chinese embassy, which is now being turned into a cultural center. And there's such strong feeling about this that even when I was there in Serbia several months ago, well, actually, yeah, it's almost a year ago now, they were Chinese people dressed, for their wedding day, taking photos outside the Chinese embassy. So this narrative that China and Serbia suffered together is something I think very carefully crafted. And so we see a decline in Serbia wanting to join the EU. It went from 51% to 50% in 1 year, but that's a small decline. But it's actually, we see as Chinese investments increase in that area, they have to become in the EU member state, you have to follow certain rules and regulations and make the acquis, all the rules of the EU. And so at one point, 6 years ago, it was 89% compliance, but it's actually been reduced to 69% compliance. And it's getting pulled further and further away from the EU. So the Balkans paradox is really a problem because the EU strategy is to help invest in these countries, make them more stable, but Chinese investments are actually destabilizing it. And China enjoys, the kind of stable nature. And I guess another little anecdote, during the height of the COVID-19 crisis, a plane flew in to Belgrade. President Vučić went to the airport to meet it. There was a Chinese flag. He embraced it. He kissed the flag. And he said, "You're here to help us. Thank you, China." But what very few people know, and this is kind of the problem, is the EU paid for that plane. So the EU funded the plane to bring Chinese masks and material and PPE to Serbia, but they didn't get any credit for it. And when those people got off the plane, one of the key members was actually a photographer and a videographer and people making, good publicity to send back the domestic audience back in mainland China. So in the PRC, I should say. So I think that the EU has a lot to learn actually from China. And if you really dig down into the figures, the EU has put far more money into Serbia, but the impression of many Serbs is that, no, it's Chinese money. So this is a real dilemma for the EU, and they really do need to up their game. And then I just wanted to, this idea of, the financing, there was a lot of over-promising and under-delivering, especially in the 17+1 countries. So there's kind of promise fatigue. They had expected much more. But what happened, China kind of learned which countries they could really count on. And for example, Hungary has blocked or watered down many proposals that the EU has made. And so that's all they really need. They just need one country to act that way, unless leadership changes in that country. So they try to cultivate relations with others. But as the funds are running low, as we're very much aware of, their investment patterns also changed to more high tech. So Germany, France, the UK, that really attracted far more investment from Chinese companies. So let me just make sure. And the other big sticking point in all of this is that these infrastructure projects that China is investing in the 17+1 countries don't hook up with EU projects. So with EU highway projects and various, so the narrative originally was, we want to work with you, EU, we want to strengthen the EU. But at the end of the day, there's a lot more skepticism towards Beijing because these projects do not strengthen the EU. In fact, it's eroding some of the EU institutions. And one other anecdote, Poland had a road contract in preparation for the football match, the big world championship there. And a Chinese company had the lowest bid. And so, great, they started building the road, but they didn't understand what a frog tunnel was. And so EU, I mean, this example is always kind of trotted out to show how complex EU rules and regulations are for the Chinese to understand, because many of these companies have experience from Africa. So their experience in Africa, they tried to translate to this region, but all the EU rules and regulations in Africa, they never had to have a frog tunnel, which is a tunnel that has to go under a road to protect wildlife. So the Chinese had a lot of trouble with these rules and regulations, and ultimately they lost the project. It finished, and it was with a great loss of face, and it was considered a really bad disaster because the Chinese had said they would build these roads and they could not complete the job. So I think this is a stumbling block for many Chinese companies. And excuse me. I was in Slovenia at the Bled Strategic Forum at the end of August, the previous year before COVID-19. And I saw there were so many Chinese at this event. So I asked, what's going on? Why are there so many Chinese here? So they told me that they were having the 17+1 think tank event on the sidelines of this. So I asked them nicely if I could attend, and they couldn't say no. So they allowed me, and I sat at the back of the room, and I was really fascinated by how it worked. The two people running this event, one had been an expert on Tito's reforms in Yugoslavia. So she had such a depth of experience. She spoke many languages, and she knew the ins and outs of the whole region. And her male counterpart was an expert on Poland. So he had been following Solidarity. I mean, he spoke Polish. He had a great deal of experience in the region as well. So I don't think there's anyone in Europe that can match this type of depth of expertise. So there's a great deal of expertise. Whether others are listening to what these people are learning, it's unclear. But we know that China likes to work bilaterally. If you're a country the size of the Czech Republic, it's a massive asymmetry. So they have these groupings, but in reality, it's just one by one by one. And the other thing is they try to get all these countries to compete with each other. And that way China is able to get a better deal. For example, we know about the port in Trieste that China was supposed to invest in, but many ports in that same region, for example, Slovenia wanted China to invest in this airport as well. So what they do is they try to play each city against or off each other to get better deals. And the other thing is you learn that Beijing tells everybody, you know, you're my main gateway to Europe. So when these countries get together, they're like, well, no, I am. No, you are. So it's like 27 countries have been promised that they're the main gateway on China's Belt and Road Initiative. And about the train, I have to add, the longest train route, if you like Guinness World of Records, is from Yiwu all the way to Madrid. And so these are receiving subsidies. And obviously shipping is far less expensive. 90% of world trade is done by shipping, but these rail cars are being subsidized. And so what would happen, China would send these items to Spain, and then they didn't have enough things to send back. So they would send some rail cars with wine, olive oil, but the other cars would actually have to be put on a ship, and it was completely inexpensive. So, you know, so we would call it Obor, one belt, one road, or Obao, one belt, one way. So you really could see the inefficiencies in this. And because the EU is against these types of subsidies, China's like, no, give us time, give us time, give us time. But we've seen with the pandemic, actually, because of the problems with air travel and things like that, the rail travel actually did extremely well during the pandemic. So China said, just give us time, see what happens. And I saw a figure, let me see if I can dig it up here real quick. Yes, in the People's Daily yesterday, the number of China-Europe freight trains hit a record high of 10,180, up by 54% during the pandemic. So this is something that many people looked at skeptically in the past, but actually during the pandemic, it turned out to work very well, which no one would have perceived. So the last thing, okay, so I have to be short now. So so we had the land Silk Road, the maritime Silk Road, but things keep getting added. So of course we have the digital Silk Road, which in my view is the most important. And we see Europe as a playground on this. Africa, South America, it's very difficult to compete now with Huawei. But we see under even the Trump administration, this has been the real sticking point in transatlantic relations. And they have made it very clear that they want, you know, they use nice language, trusted vendors. And this language can actually backfire because Serbia signed an agreement at the White House that they would only work with trusted vendors. And they thought, well, we didn't think you were talking about Huawei. So you can sign agreements if you make the language so opaque. But anyway, in Europe you have, well, the UK, we've seen a 180-degree turn from the golden era of embracing Huawei. And that actually had an echo effect on the rest of the continent. So we see France use very careful language. They use the trusted vendors. Sweden chose not to, they banned Huawei. So now they're in a court case. Huawei is suing them. So it's very important how the legal regime and the language used. And I think that Germany is the biggest holdout. It's the largest economy in Europe, and they have incredible trade ties. So it becomes very difficult for Merkel, even though her intelligence agency has warned her about this. So everyone's kind of watching which way Germany will go. How will that play in with the Biden administration? So the digital Silk Road, I think, has been made very clear. NATO just had their reflection published. And that's one of the key issues, because I feel that if there's not a secure network, it will be very difficult to continue to have secure communications, and this is key for the alliance. I just want to make sure. And going on to the Health Silk Road, it was enunciated far earlier, but it got a lot of traction during COVID-19, and we saw with the pandemic in Italy, the Prime Minister received a call saying we'll work together on the Health Silk Road. So we see a lot of competition for data, information, and Ursula von der Leyen made it very clear after the EU-China summit, the virtual summit. She said during the press conference that she was annoyed about how Chinese were hacking European hospitals. So we see that this has become a real point of contention, this race for the vaccine, and China will probably do very well with that in the developing world. It's a very attractive narrative, but in Europe, I think that it's also becoming a sticking point, especially with what happened during the initial days of the COVID crisis. We know in Italy, for example, Europe wasn't prepared. A lot of the PPE had already been sent abroad for others. German companies and French companies were fearful that they didn't have enough things for themselves. So they initially said no to Italy. Italy was turned to China. China did everything they could to help them. So this actually gave China some very good publicity, but that was the initial steps. And so mask diplomacy quickly morphed into a type of Wolf warrior diplomacy. But I should just jump now to my conclusions to this part because I don't want to talk too long on this. I think that, hold on. Space, Silk Road, and Polar Road, the Polar Silk Road, these are additions to the first enunciation. And I think it was a much smarter strategy to introduce these things slower, step by step, because otherwise it would have just been far too dramatic. And this way, China also could see what sticks, what was working. People were learning on the ground. Initially, people were able to get investments as long as you said you had a Belt and Road project. And I knew a couple of Chinese bankers who were unable to leave up to 2 years ago. So because there's so much money that was lost initially in poor investments, non-performing investments, the Chinese even said during conferences, we really need help. We don't know what's going to work. And so it's been a very steep learning curve. And I think Jonathan points out in his book that the more they learn, the more experience that they gain, they could tweak it and it might become even better and more important. But the fact that they are the only country in the world with such a major kind of branding, I think that this brings people, it brings their attention, but on the train wreck side of it, if they cannot deliver, and we're seeing it's far more difficult for them to kind of hide what's happening with Hong Kong, Xinjiang, threats towards Taiwan, this type of authoritarian surveillance that many people in Europe are fearful of. And so the one thing now with the president-elect Biden, there's kind of a great deal of discussion about a transatlantic reset. And one of the issues that they really do want to work on together, if will seems to be there, is how to work together on technology and create standards, because with the digital Silk Road, we see China actually establishing standards. And this is something that is a big threat both to Europe and to the US. So I think that the other narratives are far more positive, but the digital Silk Road is clearly seen as a threat, especially by the US and by Europe. Thanks.
Thank you, Teresa. As you pointed out, there's just so many dimensions right now. And I wonder how the Chinese are seeing the cost and benefit of these dimensions. Again, you might be sort of repeating the same thing with digital Silk Road, pre-existing commitments, and then turn into something else and all that. So we have a couple of questions coming in. So at this point, we'd like to turn to the audience. And there are two questions on the health Silk Road. So as you mentioned, it's been mass diplomacy has been a big thing. And the question is that for Ms. Vlaskamp and also Liang Yuchen, whether these vaccination programs that are coming online now will use the health Silk Road as a backbone to intensify relationship between China and other countries. So perhaps I'll ask Teresa to very quickly answer that, and then to allow John and Eyck to offer their views as well.
Oh, the health Silk Road, the vaccine program. I didn't think you were going to come right to me. Sorry. The health Silk Road, the vaccine program. I think the public really thinks China. I mean, you have Russia promoting their own vaccine. There seems to be a real competition between US, Russia, and China. And so this idea, the Europeans tried to pool, I think it was like 18 billion for vaccine research. They wanted to have like a joint project. But I think that there's a great deal of writing on this. And I think China wants, because of the muddying of the waters about the origins of COVID-19, I think that there has been a huge drive for China to be seen as the savior of COVID-19. So they've been really determined to get this vaccine program out. What is a health Silk Road? It's another very amorphous thing. I've been in touch with people in 17+1 countries, and they told me that during this time, China has been trying to group them all together, doing these virtual seminars on best practices. So even during this period of COVID-19, China has used that as a way to communicate. We have best practices. We want to share that with you in 17+1 countries. I haven't heard them do that with other members of the EU. So it's another way to cultivate influence. And I think that when it was enunciated in Italy, everyone thought it was a new thing, the Health Silk Road, but it was actually something that was perceived far earlier along the earlier days of the Belt and Road Initiative. So how this will be implemented, which countries get it first, is it reliable? These are all big questions.
Great, thank you. John, did you want to say something? Yeah.
Sure. So I think the Health Silk Road is an interesting, I think it's, frankly, another branding exercise right now. And as Teresa mentioned, health was one issue among many issues, many policy issues that have been mentioned in previous, Belt and Road documents. Belt and Road is not just infrastructure; it's also supposed to include people-to-people exchanges and policy coordination across a whole host of issues. So one of the earlier documents, it's about 15 pages long, has about a paragraph dedicated to health issues, coordination on health policy along the Belt and Road. And among the objectives that it mentions is sharing information to prevent pandemics, right? So I think we're living in a world right now that is really suffering because the Health Silk Road failed to begin with. And so, it's in the aftermath of a pandemic that this has become, a brand that's being, put into statements when China meets with other countries. I think the one other interesting observation here is that I think China was able to use some of the relations that it's built through Belt and Road lending, Belt and Road project activity, to create almost a Belt and Road echo chamber during the early days of the pandemic, when the Chinese government was really in need of support for its position. It wanted statements praising its response to the pandemic. It was able to get those from Italy, from Serbia, from Ethiopia, from Pakistan. You have this really mini echo chamber, many countries participating in that, heavy Belt and Road participants. So, but there hasn't been any really systematic health infrastructure part of the Belt and Road. There are health-related projects here and there, but there's nothing systematic. And in fact, one project like a hospital near Gwadar, at one point, 70 or 80% of the patients were Chinese patients, right? That's a hospital that China built in Pakistan for Chinese workers working on projects. So probably not, the model that they want to hold up for the Health Silk Road. But so I do think, again, we are talking about a lot of branding. It helps to have a vaccine now. That's a pretty powerful incentive. But just historically, the Health Silk Road did not deliver on what was promised.
Great. Eyck?
So I believe, and I'm on record in Foreign Affairs predicting this, that the Health Silk Road is the future of the Belt and Road. First of all, there's two ways that 2020 is going to be remembered. One is that China was the opaque, untrustworthy authoritarian dictatorship that hid the early reports that there was in fact a virulent coronavirus coming out of Wuhan and allowed international travelers to continue to seed the virus to the world. Or there's another story you could tell in which the pandemic just sort of happened and China was the first country in the world to get on top of it, the first country in the world to wipe it out within its borders, and then potentially the country that came up with the vaccine that will go ahead and vaccinate most of the developing world. This story is precisely why it is of the utmost political importance in Beijing that once the Chinese coronavirus vaccines are proven to be safe and effective. We learned this morning that the Sinopharm vaccine is in fact effective with 100% efficacy at reducing severe cases of COVID-19, and it's perfectly safe. We're going to get data on 3 more Chinese vaccines soon. The Chinese government is going to put tremendous political and subsidy resources into making sure that this is deployed abroad. Unlike Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, the major Western drug makers whose early production runs have been pre-purchased by developed countries. China can earmark its entire early production of vaccines for export since they don't have any COVID at home. And we see this in any number of ways. We see this in statements that Xi Jinping has made, that the Chinese vaccine will be a global public good, implying that it's going to be heavily subsidized or even entirely subsidized. Li Keqiang, Chinese premier, has visited Central America, and he says that Latin American and Caribbean countries will get billions of dollars of Chinese subsidies in order to purchase Chinese vaccines. Or you can look at statements that are made by the spokesman or the deputy chair of the National Development and Reform Commission, the super body within China that both coordinates the Belt and Road and all of China's own industrial policy, saying that looking ahead, you should focus on 3 aspects of the Belt and Road: the health Silk Road, the green Silk Road, and the digital Silk Road. Aside from allowing China to correct the record in its own favor on the pandemic, it meshes well with China's own domestic economic reorientation as they're beginning to inch away from this debt-fueled model of development and to look more at quality growth. So I think coming out of the pandemic, when so many of China's legacy projects, if they were not already running into trouble, are likely to face various kinds of debt distress, they're going to be an ongoing burden that Chinese banks will have to carry for years to come. But going forward, China seems to have signaled that it's not giving up on the Belt and Road brand, and it's also not initiating many more of these old traditional infrastructure projects. So I think the future of this initiative is very much about health, digital, and green. And you know what? That may actually work more effectively for both sides. It's less capital intensive for China, and it means that partner countries can get their benefits up front without taking on more risks. So I think we may find that 2020 was an inflection year, and that the Health Silk Road and the effective rollout of a Chinese COVID vaccine was in fact the thing that made Belt and Road no longer plausible to spin as a debt trap project, but really as an effective brand for China on the world stage.
Wow, fascinating. If I could bring all of you back one step and think about how this all started and to reflect on the motivation. So we have a couple of questions which I'll discuss in conjunction. One is from Dr. Li Tang, who talks about how the initial sort of reaction, well, part of the initial reaction of China to the American strategy to pivot to Asia and its sort of long-standing blockade of the maritime routes in Asia could have been the motivation for the Chinese Silk Road, especially the inland sort of Eurasian heartland kind of project. And Shahrukh Khan also talked about how the Chinese grand strategy, while it's not entirely clear, perhaps you can tell us more about the end game of that strategy at this point. Would you like to say something about these 2 aspects of the origin of grand strategy and whether the Chinese are reacting to American first moves? Thank you.
I'll just make a quick comment.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Xi and Hung told me several years ago that if the US could pull off TTIP and TPP, it would have been a masterstroke. And so with I think that this did, this idea of go west because of all the pressure in the maritime area. There's a famous story of, the Chinese thought this is uncontested territory. It's post-Soviet bloc. We have space to move that way. So I think that really did inspire to a great deal this formulation of the land Silk Road. But I'll leave it to the experts who just wrote 2 books.
I would just encourage everyone when they, either see a corridor drawn on a map or hear about one being proposed, that they ask whether it actually exists. So you'll read sometimes people saying, "Oh, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, be very strategic. It's going to allow China to get lots of energy, through Pakistan, avoiding the Malacca Strait. There is no pipeline going from, Gwadar into China, and building one would be incredibly expensive, and it would go through some very dangerous territory. And if there was something happening in the Malacca Strait, there's a significant likelihood that whatever forces are involved there would also be able to take out a pipeline in Pakistan. And so, I just think it's worth, asking whether these things are real. And so just the overland dimension of Belt and Road is also very constrained by what's happening in Western China. When I was, visiting Kashgar and, going to Tashkurgan, these places that, start to get close to the border with Pakistan, really struck by, how intrusive the security state is there, and going beyond the human rights violations, but just focusing on what it's like to run a business there. There's not a lot of movement of anything because it's getting stopped at checkpoints, and the borders are not very smooth. So I think that there's, it's worth really asking, like, on the ground, is this delivering, what we see in these grand maps? How much strategic value would it actually have? Some of these projects would also expose China to some significant risks.
Thank you. And famous last words from Eyck.
Well, John knows where if he speaks on this, because he actually led a project doing yeoman's work to actually map all of these individual initiatives and see how they line up and are interconnected with one another. And while there are some cases of individual countries, Sri Lanka is a good one, that got a really nice road network thanks to Chinese assistance. I think it's fair to say that it is never going to be more economical to ship your goods by rail 8,000 miles across Eurasia than to put it on a merchant ship and sail it along the usual route. And so whenever I hear someone talking about something along the Belt and Road, as if these are trade corridors, like a highway with exits off of it in the way you would understand it, I think that's usually an indication that they're drinking the Kool-Aid or haven't actually been to many of these projects.
All right. So we have money betting on Health Silk Road, Digital Silk Road, and I also put my money into the Polar Silk Road. So in response to John, the Northern Sea Route is real, the power of Siberia is real, Yamal is real, and the joint Sino-Russian naval exercise is real. So there are many things we should be considering. This will be, unfortunately, the end of today's video panel on China's One Belt, One Road. It's been an enlightening discussion and a great pleasure to chair this event. And I hope that we at the Center for Geopolitics will have more events on this topic in the next few months. I also want to remind you that you'll be able to find a recording of this event on our website in a couple of days. So thank you very much for watching. And thank you, of course, to our panelists, including Teresa, John, and Eyck. And we hope to see you again soon at future Center for Geopolitics events. Thank you and good night.